Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Legislative elections happen every 2 years, but 2024 is a bit different, with competitive hyper-local precinct races and more money pouring into legislative matchups than we've ever seen before. I'm Melissa Davlin. Idaho Reports starts now. Hello and welcome to Idaho Reports. This week we talked to Ventures Ahlquist CEO Dr. Tommy Ahlquist and Unite America campaigns advisor Amos Rothstein about competitive precinct races and campaign spending. But first, Secretary of State and Chief Election Nerd Phil McGrane joined me on Wednesday to talk about the lead up to Tuesday's primary election. Yeah, we've talked a lot about voter confidence with you over the last 2 years since you were candidate, McGrane. Since taking office, what have you done to shore up the process or reassure voters that this is a secure elections process?
Yeah, I think we've made a number of upgrades. I mean, part of it is just making elections accessible. As we like to say in the office, making elections fun again. So one of the big changes we've done is the new Vote Idaho website. That's really trying to bring all of the election information to one page, make it easy to register, request an absentee ballot, find election results. That'll be one of the things that we're working on for this particular election is a new results page. So there's a lot of really good things there, and just really bringing all that information in one spot. I know you're someone who's navigated all these websites over the years, so hopefully you've seen the benefits of that, or some of the data that we share that's just really interesting insight in terms of voters moving to Idaho and what's happening in the state. And then you add to that, through the legislative process, some of the changes that we've made statutorily. So we passed legislation this year saying that none of the tabulation equipment will be connected to the internet. In addition to doing that, we also updated that language because it was all written for punch card machines, and some of our laws were just overdue for an overhaul. And so we were able to upgrade to modern technology in that front. Similarly, we reformed the identification requirements for registration. There were very different requirements to register to vote for the ID you showed versus voting. And so trying to bring that together makes it easier for poll workers, and really it's actually proven out to be really successful in terms of identifying and make it smooth for people who need to be able to register to vote, and in some cases stopping people who probably shouldn't have been able to register to vote in the past.
You say making elections fun again. Elections have always been fun,
especially for people like us.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
It's so funny to hear you say we're upgrading the technology for the voting machines, and at the same time you're removing it from the internet to kind of create that barrier against those cyber attacks that we've heard so much about. What are you hearing from other secretaries of state across the nation about different threats that they're receiving to their systems, and how does that shape what you're doing here?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. That's been one of the neat things stepping into this role, is working with the other secretaries around the country. So I actually sit as the Republican secretary on the EII-SAC. It's the election information, basically cyber information sharing exchange between the 50 states. So Secretary Bellows from Maine and I are the two secretaries that sit on this to really try to get more resources for cybersecurity. I mentioned no connectivity to the internet. That's because really that's the simplest and easiest, most cost-effective solution. But there still are other systems, our voter registration system, the computers that all of the counties use to administer the election. So we're being very vigilant. And a state like Idaho, it's really important to be a player in this space because we have the Ada counties of the world, so often referred to as the great state of Ada because of the resources here. But we have two counties, Clark and Camas, that have less than 350 registered voters. They have the same cybersecurity challenges and the same administration challenges that Ada County does, but nowhere near the resources. So we're trying to tap into what resources we can to make them more resilient, because nowadays we're all interconnected. And that's important. That's what helps prevent voter fraud. That's what keeps our voter rolls clean. And so part of our office's role is to really support and facilitate these things for the counties so that we can all have confidence when we go. The results are what we expect. Everyone's vote counts. It only counts once. I think we've got a really good system in place, and we really, over the last 4 years, starting with Secretary Denny, but now into what we're doing, have been able to bolster that.
you mentioned some of the data that your site has put out, and one of the things that caught my eye and so many other people's eye was the where new voters are coming from. Coming from out of state, a lot of them are registering or affiliating as Republicans. We have, as you know, so many new voters in this state because of that population growth over the last few years. How does that change voter outreach efforts?
It's been interesting since we shared that data, how much attention that's gotten, not just here in Idaho, but nationally. The Washington Post has written about it, the Seattle Times, just because it's fascinating to see between states where people are shifting. And you're right, we've had tremendous growth. I think one of the really big things we've done this election is we have an effort to raise awareness for the primary election. So we've got TV ads, we've got radio ads, newspaper. We're trying to hit every possible medium in terms of connecting with voters. And that's because, as you know, the primary election is so significant. And we never see anywhere near the turnout for the primary that we will in November for the general. And while we all know there's a presidential election coming up and there will be a lot of attention in November, for us, and you're seeing it right now through our campaign finance data, like this is the Super Bowl for Idaho. Whether it's District 19, which is the most solidly Democratic district, that will be determined here in May. Similarly, in District 14, one of its neighbors, that will be determined here in May. And so trying to just raise awareness that May is a time that we vote. Hopefully we'll see increased turnout. I think some of the activity we're seeing in the election will increase turnout as well. These precinct committee races that have normally gone unnoticed are bringing more attention to the election in an interesting way. And so hopefully we're connecting with people. I think the biggest change is just getting information out to voters. That's where the Vote Idaho website, that's where my efforts on the voter guide is trying to say, like, we have people who just moved here in the last year. They don't know who these people are. They don't know who the candidates they're choosing from. Can we get more information out to voters?
And you touched on so many things that I want to ask you about, particularly spending. It is bonkers expensive, along with, we have more people and we have more money going into these races. From your perspective, is it just bigger numbers in a spreadsheet, or does that change your approach to how you work with campaign finance reporting?
It's tough to really emphasize just how much more money we're seeing this cycle than before. I know the Idaho Capital Sun did a story recently just looking at April's numbers and showed that there was a threefold increase in the amount of spending from 2 years ago to this cycle for legislative races. I noted just before I came over here, in the last 48 hours, there's been almost $750,000 spent on independent expenditures alone, most of that coming from out of state. Coming from these Washington, D.C. groups. We're seeing way more money coming in. I saw a photo that someone shared where a voter had received 12 different mailings, all different attacks. There were, I think, 4 were in support. The remaining 8 were opposed. 4 of those mailings were all from the same group. They were different mailers from the same organization. We're going to see record numbers in terms of the spending for this election, and it's worth noting, there are no statewide races. The governor's not on the ballot. So the things that normally draw big dollars aren't even on the ballot this year. It's really these legislative races that we're just seeing. It's really a game changer. I think that ties to our growth as a state and just the vitriol in politics these days. National level, local level, it's all the same.
And for people who aren't familiar, who aren't the election nerds, what is an independent expenditure and how is it different than what a candidate reports?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of time when you see a yard sign on the side of the road, a candidate put it up, it was paid for by the candidate, they raise money. Candidates have limits. So for legislative races, they can only collect up to $1,000, doesn't matter who it's from.
Per donor.
Per donor, good question, yep. The independent expenditures are, this United States Supreme Court has held organizations, other people can spend unlimited, and so they just can't connect and coordinate with the candidates themselves. And so the candidates, when you see a candidate's name or something, whether it's for or against, there's no one's talking to them. No one's asking for their permission before it comes out. Instead, these attacks,
or they're not supposed to.
They're not supposed to. Right. We do regulate that. We're very active in investigations right now on a number of different issues. But one of it is there's no limit. So we anticipate we'll see a couple organizations easily spend $500,000. And in Idaho politics, that's huge amounts of money. A typical legislative candidate may raise $20,000 to $30,000. A really, really active candidate will raise $100,000. And so to see $500,000 in some of these races is wild.
These outside groups, and you mentioned a lot of it is coming from Washington, D.C., Are there any specific races that they are targeting? I can think of a couple off the top of my head, but what are you seeing?
No, it actually looks like it's a pretty broad swath, and you're even seeing some like interesting exchanges between what I'll call the caucuses in the groups. There's the Freedom Caucus, the Main Street Caucus, and others. But it's interesting because I don't think DC is necessarily coordinating at all with people locally, because you're seeing frustration in both directions. I think the two that get the most attention are the Pro Tem and the Speaker of the House. I think these DC groups, if they're able to knock off either of those individuals, that's a huge feather in their cap going back to their donors. And I think that's fearful because it's people who aren't connected necessarily to people here in Idaho, and that just feels. I think we want Idaho elections to be determined by Idahoans, and hopefully that information gets out there. But from where we sit, it's wild to see all the activity that's going on.
Will that spending then inform maybe potential changes to campaign finance law or proposals to change campaign finance law in the future?
I'm hopeful that we have the opportunity in the next legislative session to really revisit campaign finance. Now, I've always had thoughts about it, but now that I'm sitting in the role and we're spending the majority of our time on enforcement, whether that's being the tattletale department because people are like, please tell them to stop picking on me, or because we're having like actual issues that we are having to work with the AG's office on enforcement with, there really is a need for reform. Our laws were written in the 70s. It was a citizens initiative. It shows up that way in a number of ways. And I think candidates, it's been interesting because more legislators are pinging us than I think historically have, because everyone's frustrated. Especially, our laws really weren't written with this outside money in mind. It was all local when it happened before. And so we really do need to revisit how we do this. Things like independent expenditures, not so that we're not going to see it stop. That's one of the things. Free speech is an important thing that we need to protect, and political speech is the #1 form of free speech. But at the same time, disclosure as to who is it that's influencing things, where's this money coming from, we could do a lot better in terms of getting that out to the public.
We're also seeing a lot more spending on precinct committee races than I know I was expecting. I knew that they would be. I knew they would be competitive. I did not expect this. First of all, for those who aren't familiar, what is a precinct?
Precinct committeemen, they are officers for the political parties, so both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have them on the ballot. Typically, you only see one candidate file for many of these seats. They're the people who go to the monthly meetings and are the ones helping get out the vote for their political party or support their candidates. It's become way more contentious. That's exactly what we're seeing. There's way more competitive races than ever before in this cycle, and money, like real money being put into precinct committee races. Those races aren't regulated by our sunshine laws. So we don't post, we don't share. They don't have to disclose who the donors are. And there are no limits, and we're kind of seeing that. I saw a precinct committeeman billboard on my way into work this morning. That seems wild in terms of all of this. I will note, because as we try to promote this election, trivia has been our theme. One of the most interesting things is the precinct committeeman position is the only position in Idaho that has a minimum number of votes required, and that's 5 votes. You cannot, even if you're unopposed, you must get 5 votes to be elected as a precinct committeeman. Even the governor doesn't require 5 votes, which is just an odd tweak in our laws.
For those 350 or so voters in Clark County, that might actually be problematic.
I have seen candidates not get the necessary 5 votes in the past. So this just shows my nerdiness when it comes to the elections, but there's a lot to watch with the primary coming up.
So you mentioned that precinct committee races, they're not beholden to the same campaign finance reporting.
That's right. There realistically is no regulation in terms of the precinct committee position. We advise people to put the paid for by, but even if they do, there's no linking it back to what that source really is.
And I imagine those laws were written back when parties had to beg people to run for these positions. That's not the case anymore. Do the laws need to change?
It's an interesting thing. The precinct committee positions, they really are party offices. They're not public offices like we think of as a legislature or a state office. And so there's this weird interplay where here we are as the state helping select members of a private organization, the political parties. And I think there's differing opinions on how much state involvement should there really be. Are these really elected positions? Some people think yes, they are. Others think no, they're not. We could probably revisit that as a state. To your point, we've never seen this in the past. This is all bigger in terms of the money, the interest, and even the fighting. I think there's a presumption that within the political parties, everyone's getting along and they're trying to stop the other side. Well, we're certainly seeing in both political parties, but especially here in Idaho in the Republican Party, a lot more contention in the ranks.
You don't say. Secretary of State Phil McGrane, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
For my full interview with Secretary McGrane, head to the Idaho Reports YouTube channel, youtube.com/Idaho Reports. Legislative races happen every 2 years, but as Secretary McGrane mentioned, spending and competitive precinct races are setting this cycle apart. Amos Rothstein, campaigns advisor for Unite America and former executive director of the Idaho Republican Party, and Dr. Tommy Ahlquist, CEO of Ventures Ahlquist, joined me Thursday to discuss why that is. Thank you both so much for joining us this week. Amos, I wanted to start with you. You're running for precinct committeeman. And this is after you were executive director of the Idaho State Republican Party. Why did you choose to go from the top to running for one of the grassroots positions?
Well, because the top moves when the grassroots grow. And we're seeing now a very different Republican Party in terms of leadership, in terms of style, in terms of how they are suggesting we pick our nominees and who gets kind of the nod from the party than when I was working at the party just a couple of years ago. To me, it's concerning. And if we want to grow the Republican Party again, and if we want it to be inclusive, a big tent party that is welcoming of not only new people into the state, but people who've lived here a long time and see that there's candidates that they can resonate with, we have to change the local leadership, because the precinct people are the people that meet with their neighbors, that talk to the people in their neighborhoods about the central committee in their county, and that inform them of things going on with local candidates and local incumbents. And so that, to me, is probably the most essential thing we can do to right the wrongs of, I think, where the party's gone, is make sure that sensible people are getting in these positions, and hopefully enough people think I'm sensible to win the race, but that's why I'm running.
You know, those changes that have happened in the Republican Party haven't come out of nowhere. They were voted on by the current precinct captains. This is something that the overwhelming majority of Republicans who attended the summer meetings and looked at the platform changes, these are changes that they wanted. And so is it fair to say that this is the direction that most Idaho Republicans want the party to go in?
I don't think so. I think that there was a very concerted effort by, I think, who took over the party and who is now the incumbent precinct people to really narrowly target voters to vote the very last thing on the ballot and make them fill in that bubble. It is probably the highest undervote spot on the ballot, and by that I mean the thing left blank on the ballot when people vote. Because people don't know who these people are, they don't know what this position is or what they do. And so now I think there has been a slow awakening of the relevance of this, because I think the majority of Idahoans aren't seeing themselves, their vision, their ethics, their morals, or their policies represented by the current state central committee.
When I started covering Idaho politics, a lot of people had to beg people to run for those precinct positions. The parties had to beg candidates to sign up for this. And now they're not only competitive, but there's money going into them. And precinct committee candidates are not beholden to the same campaign finance laws as legislative candidates or county candidates or statewide candidates. Do you think that should change? Should we know who's paying for your mailers going out?
I think we should know who does pay for them. I think transparency in government and politics is extremely important. And I think with the talk of elections being stolen and rigged, I think whether it's not true, but the importance of it, the core of the message is that people want to see who's behind the curtain and who's paying for things. And so I think transparency is really important. I think putting the stamp on every piece of mail saying it's paid for by this person, or every call that you get a robocall saying it was paid for by that person, is really, really essential to a functional democracy.
Tommy, you...
Amen. I wish I could vote for you. I wish
different precinct, different precinct. You, of course, ran for governor in 2018 in the Republican primary, and now you're really active in the spending arena between your holdings and you as an individual and your wife. I think last calendar year I found about $60,000 that went out to different PACs and candidates. Does that sound about right?
That's probably about right, yeah.
So how do you decide what races to tackle and which candidates to support?
Yeah, first of all, it's incredibly important to get good people that want to run and to support those people. I think the energy around this election is I really think it's really incredible. I think there's been an awakening of people that sometimes may not have paid attention, and I think that's why these precinct races are going to become important. And then it takes money to win these elections, and I think if you look at some of these legislators that represent your values and listen to their constituents and need support, we're all about that. And I think we pay a lot of attention to local civic races, we pay attention to the state legislature races, and we're paying attention now to these precinct races. So I think it does show an awakening of maybe the average business kind of minded voter, because these things matter. They matter in our businesses, they matter in our hospitals, they matter in our schools. And I'd love to get to a Republican Party and politics back to where we talked about policy a lot more. Yeah. We talked about education, we talked about infrastructure, we talked about things we have in common and how we can grow and maintain this heritage of this wonderful state we live in, and instead of all the time making it so crazy. And if you just look at the last week of what's going on between, I mean, the Republican Party of today eats its own. Right. It's the people they go after, the way they're, I don't know their end game, because it doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense from where I came from and where I look at life and the way you collaborate to make things work, and how much we all love this state, to have people really self-interested and insecure that are making decisions that are I don't think they represent the average voter or average Republican voter in Idaho.
When you talk about people eating their own, you're talking about Republican infighting. Oh, yeah. Arguably, isn't that what you're doing by contributing in these Republican primaries?
I call eating my own the lies. I mean, I think that's different. I think financially supporting someone and getting to know them and what's in their heart and saying, hey, I like what you represent and I'm going to give you funds, is very different than having out-of-state PAC money come in. And I mean, for heaven's sakes, now Mike Moyle is not conservative enough for Idaho, and you look at what's going on with him. I look at what happened to some of the long-time leadership in the Republican Party that essentially were taken out by the current regime, and I just think it's short-sighted, and I think ultimately it's going to awaken a lot of efforts against them.
Absolutely, and I agree. And I think there's a difference between what I think most of the Republicans in the state want, and you could see it by who won those primaries in 2022. You know, Phil McGrane won, Debbie Critchfield won, Governor Little beat Janice McGean in all but 4 counties, and you see. When you go to the state conventions, Jim Risch and Mike Crapo being booed for not being conservative, which is crazy. You know, in the lineup of who is in the United States Senate, they are some of the most conservative members of the United States Senate, and it really is a difference between a small government idea of Republicans and a burn it down idea of Republicans, where it's this very libertarian chaos, no functional government at all. And I think. There is a difference between a libertarian and a Republican, and I think that is what we are seeing in a lot of these fights in this party right now. Is that the libertarians have came over to the GOP and said, "We want in," and they aren't Republicans. Republicans believe in a functional, limited government. Libertarians do not, and so you're seeing this fight play out in these precinct races and at the state level, like you've never seen it before. But we're not dealing with Republicans in the same traditional sense. And they love to call, I think, people like me who've always been a small government Republican a rhino, and I think a lot of people like us, like to call them liars, libertarians imitating actual Republicans, because that's what it's gotten down to. It's gotten down to name calling. It's this, it's a schoolyard politics. But I hope that these sensible traditional Republicans that made Idaho what it was, the Phil Batt Republicans, the Butch Otter Republicans, can make a case for civility and for common sense, and that's really what the fight is now, I think.
You've been a candidate, you've worked on campaigns, not just in Idaho, but right now you're the campaigns advisor for Unite America. Is there a role for negative campaigning and that name calling to get voters' attention? Is that part of the game, or is it not helpful at all from your perspective as a campaigns manager?
I wish it didn't boil down to that, but it seems to be what gets people's attention, unfortunately. That is, people have sort of looked at politics, I think, especially in the most recent era, as sort of the sports team mentality, as sort of a sporting match. And you have to go where the voters are. If the voters want to see the fight, then hopefully we can make the fight about policy, and we can make it about...
It's a little different than that, though. I think it'd be naive to say negative campaigning doesn't work, because they'll tell you. The consultants you hire for a lot of money will tell you it works. And the game plans that they play are, let me find something about you that may have a grain of truth to it, and let me blow that up and put it in a way that you're going to look like you're a liar and a thief and the worst person that's walked the face of the earth. And that's the game. Unfortunately, that game gets played, and it's effective. So, I'd be a hypocrite to say we didn't do some of the same stuff. Do I regret it? Yeah, because at the end of the day, I don't know. Down in the, you're out visiting people. I don't know how effective it actually is sometimes, and it's one of the regrets from my campaign. I wish we wouldn't have done it, because either way, the results are probably going to be what the results are, and I think you could feel better about it not doing it, but it certainly works. They'll tell you it works, and they'll show you data that it works, but I don't know. They're basically accentuating lies when they do it.
How do you square that then? If you know something works and you want to win and you're putting a lot of money into it, but you also want to sleep at night?
You don't sleep at night, and that was part of the problem, right? I wasn't very good at it. You see these things happening back and forth, and it doesn't feel right down in the trenches, yet you do it anyway. That's why I'll never run again, Melissa.
I think I've heard you say that before on this show.
I just want to say really quickly, I think there's a time for campaigning and there's a time for legislating. And I hope that when we see the primaries end and the legislators get to Boise next year, that they act like the adults that we hope we elected. And that the campaigning stops at the door and they legislate policy.
That's actually a really good point. The other thing is, it seems like the fighting never stops now, right? You follow along these legislative sessions, and there are things that are important. They're really important to the families of Idaho, and they don't even get heard or talked about. There's not smart policy going on sometimes, because they're fighting about these things within themselves, and I just hope that someone can elevate that. And I'm really proud of what Governor Little is doing. I think he's done a great job, both he and Scott Bedke, of saying, hey, we're going to try to be the adults in the room and look out for the people of Idaho. And thank heavens, keep that up, and how can we support you more?
All right, Amos Rothstein, Dr. Tommy Ahlquist, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Remember, Election Day is this Tuesday, May 21st, and polls are open from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. in both time zones. If you still have an absentee ballot, remember that your county elections office must have it by 8 p.m. on Tuesday. It isn't enough if it's postmarked by that time, so you might need to drive down and turn it in person. For information on your polling location, visit voteidaho.gov and watch for our legislative election preview at idahoreports.org. Happy voting, and we'll see you next week.
Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho, by the Friends of Idaho Public Television, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.